What would you do if you were falsely accused on a flight simply because of the color of your skin? That's exactly what happened to Simone Carter, a black woman who was humiliated on an Orion Air flight. But what no one on that flight could have anticipated was this: she was the new CEO of the airline. This story isn't just about a shocking turn of events, it's a powerful lesson in resilience and the ability to transform an unjust system. Join us as we explore the inspiring journey of Simone Carter right now. Simone Carter pulled her small black suitcase, blending seamlessly into the bustling crowd at Atlanta International Airport's main terminal. The sunlight streaming through massive glass windows glinted off the polished marble floors, creating an atmosphere that was both modern and vibrant. The hum of overhead announcements, the chatter of travelers, and the rhythmic roll of suitcase wheels created a steady, unending flow of activity. Simone walked with a calm demeanor, her crisp white shirt and dark slacks allowing her to merge effortlessly into the crowd. No one gave her a second glance, unaware that this unassuming woman, with a simple leather crossbody bag slung over her shoulder, was the newly appointed CEO of Orion Air, a major airline grappling with numerous allegations of racial discrimination. This wasn't Simone's first business trip, but it was undoubtedly the most significant in her career. Instead of stepping into the CEO's office or delivering a grand inaugural speech to the board of directors, Simone had chosen to begin her tenure by blending in as a regular passenger. She wanted to witness firsthand the realities of the airline's operations and understand why Orion Air had been losing the trust of its customers in recent years. As she approached the check-in counters, Simone immediately noticed the scrutinizing glances exchanged among some employees. At a nearby counter, a black mother stood anxiously clutching the straps of a large bag. Her two young children fussed and cried incessantly, while a tall, stern-faced airline employee repeatedly shook his head. Simone slowed her pace, quietly observing the scene. "Ma'am, your bag exceeds the size limit. If you want to take it on board, you'll need to pay an additional fee," the employee said, his tone curt and unyielding. "Please, I'm asking for some understanding," the mother pleaded, her eyes filled with desperation. "This is all for my kids. I can't leave anything behind." "Policy is policy. We can't make exceptions," he replied coldly, handing her a payment slip. Simone narrowed her eyes, her attention drawn to the disparity unfolding right before her. At the counter next to them, a white man with an even larger suitcase was being waved through without question, greeted warmly by another staff member. The contrast was glaring. Simone felt a surge of discomfort but maintained her composure, silently taking note of the details. "This must change," she thought to herself. After completing her own check-in without incident, Simone moved toward the security checkpoint. She removed her shoes, placed her bag and suitcase on the conveyor belt, and stepped through the metal detector. Just as she was about to retrieve her belongings, a security officer signaled for her to stop. "Ma'am, I need to conduct an additional check on your bag," he said, his tone rigid. Simone raised an eyebrow slightly. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice calm and measured. "It's just a random inspection," he replied, though his gaze lingered on her longer than necessary. He began rummaging through Simone's leather bag with unnecessary thoroughness, removing each item and examining every compartment. Simone stood silently, her eyes fixed on his hands, observing every movement. She could feel the weight of the surrounding passengers' stares, curious and judgmental. One by one, the contents of her bag were inspected and placed back without comment. After a few minutes, the security officer handed her bag back without another word. Simone accepted it, offered a faint smile, and continued walking, but a bitter feeling rose within her. This wasn't the first time she had been treated this way, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. She was all too familiar with the feeling of being scrutinized simply because her skin color or appearance didn't align with someone else's biases. She entered a small cafe near her departure gate, ordered a latte, and chose a quiet corner to sit. Watching the bustling crowd pass by, Simone felt as though she were observing a living painting, vibrant yet riddled with cracks. These were the telltale signs of a system gradually breaking down. She had witnessed injustice, complicit silence, and the pervasive fear of confronting authority. As the clock ticked down to 30 minutes before boarding, Simone stood, adjusted her shirt, and retrieved her small suitcase. Just as she reached for her bag, a loud voice rang out from behind her. "Stop! What are you doing with that bag?" Simone turned around, her eyes flashing with surprise. A man in an Orion Air uniform was striding toward her, his expression stern and his voice full of authority. The name tag on his chest read, John Harris. "Excuse me, are you talking to me?" Simone asked, her tone calm and steady. "Yes, I am." John replied without hesitation. "That bag looks like one reported missing by another passenger. I need to inspect it." Simone glanced at her suitcase, her brows knitting together slightly. "This is my bag. I've had it with me since I entered the airport," she said, emphasizing each word. But John wasn't listening. He grabbed the suitcase from her hands and opened it, all under the curious gaze of nearby passengers. A few murmured amongst themselves, their eyes filled with judgment as they turned towards Simone. She stood tall, unflinching, her gaze fixed coldly on John's every movement. "This isn't the bag I'm looking for," John muttered after rummaging through every compartment and finding nothing suspicious. Yet, instead of apologizing, he tossed the suitcase back to Simone with an empty stare and walked away as if nothing had happened. Simone tightened her grip on the suitcase's handle, her eyes following John Harris as he retreated. She said nothing, but in her mind, his name was already etched for future reference. Boarding the plane, Simone found her seat in the economy section and let out a deep breath. She knew this was only the beginning. What she had just experienced only strengthened her resolve to transform a system rife with prejudice and inequity. Simone Carter was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Simone Carter entered the airplane cabin with a calm demeanor, her small suitcase in hand, and her eyes quickly scanning the rows of seats ahead. She chose a seat in the economy section, near the back of the plane, instead of the spacious first-class seats up front, the choice any VIP passenger might typically make. But Simone's decision was deliberate. She wanted to immerse herself in the real experiences faced by the majority of Orion Air passengers. The atmosphere in the economy cabin was cramped and bustling. Passengers were busy arranging their luggage, chatting among themselves, and the occasional cry of a child echoed from afar. Simone calmly located her seat. She attempted to lift her suitcase into the overhead compartment but found the space nearly full. "Hi there. Do you need some help?" A petite, young flight attendant approached her quickly, smiling warmly. Her expression was genuine, and Simone nodded appreciatively as she watched the attendant rearrange the luggage to make room for her suitcase. "Thank you. That's very kind of you," Simone said softly. "No problem at all, ma'am. Have a wonderful flight," the attendant replied, offering a friendly smile before walking away. Simone settled into her seat just as another flight attendant entered the section. This one was a tall, white woman with her hair neatly tied into a bun. The name tag on her uniform read, Clara White. Clara's smile wasn't directed at Simone. Instead, her cold gaze flickered briefly over Simone before focusing on a nearby group of passengers. Clara began engaging with the white passengers, cheerfully offering them drinks, helping them stow their luggage, and explaining the amenities on the flight. However, when she passed by Simone, she didn't stop or even acknowledge her presence. Simone said nothing, merely observing. A short while later, Clara returned, and Simone politely called out, "Excuse me, could you help me get some water?" Clara stopped, raising an eyebrow slightly before responding in a tone that carried an edge of reluctance. "We'll be serving drinks after takeoff. Please be patient." The tone in Clara's voice didn't escape Simone's attention. It wasn't a polite refusal. It was a deliberate dismissal, a subtle reminder that Simone wasn't a priority. Simone smiled faintly, saying nothing, but deep inside she began to piece together the unspoken reality of the situation. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, Simone noticed Clara bustling up and down the aisle, attentively catering to other passengers with a radiant smile. Most of her attention was directed toward the front rows, where predominantly white passengers sat, or occasionally stopping to chat with well-dressed, middle-aged men. In contrast, the section where Simone sat saw Clara only sparingly, and even then, her responses to requests were curt and devoid of enthusiasm. Simone maintained her composure. She understood that these seemingly small actions reflected a much larger issue, one she had committed to addressing when she took on the leadership role at Orion Air. The situation took an unexpected turn when a passenger seated toward the front reported to the crew that a valuable item, a high-end wristwatch, was missing from the overhead compartment. Clara appeared immediately, her expression turning serious. "When did the watch go missing? Are you sure you placed it in the overhead compartment?" Clara asked, her voice full of concern. "Yes," the man replied, his face clouded with worry. "I put it in my bag, and now it's gone." Clara's gaze swept the cabin, her eyes stopping on Simone. A flicker of suspicion crossed her face. Without much thought, Clara strode over to Simone, standing tall and adopting a stern tone. "Ma'am, I need to check your bag. We've received a report about a missing item in this area." Simone looked up, her calm eyes meeting Clara's. "I don't believe that's necessary. My bag has been in my sight the entire time," she replied, emphasizing each word. "We're simply doing our job," Clara responded, her tone brimming with authority. "If you have nothing to hide, I'm sure you wouldn't mind letting us inspect it." Around them, passengers began turning their heads, their curiosity piqued. Some whispered among themselves, their glances tinged with judgment. Simone could feel the weight of the stairs, the heavy silence pressing down on her, but she remained composed. "This is insulting," Simone said, her tone now firmer. "If you suspect someone, I suggest you rely on evidence rather than assumptions." Clara smirked, taking a step closer. "So you're saying I'm not doing my job properly?" she asked, her voice laced with challenge. "I'm saying that bias has no place on this flight, especially when it affects a passenger's dignity," Simone countered, her gaze unwavering. Simone's response made Clara hesitate briefly, but instead of backing down, Clara abruptly pointed at Simone and raised her voice. "We're trying to recover a passenger's property. If you refuse to cooperate, you'll only make yourself look more suspicious." Simone rose from her seat, smoothing out her shirt with a measured movement. "I'm willing to cooperate, but only if you treat me like a person, not a criminal," she said, her tone calm yet commanding. The cabin was now suffused with palpable tension. A few passengers turned fully in their seats, their attention fixed on the escalating exchange. Clara stared at Simone, her face a mix of anger and frustration. "You're insufferably arrogant," Clara blurted out, and before anyone could react, she raised her hand and slapped Simone hard enough to leave the entire cabin in stunned silence. Simone tilted her head slightly, her hand instinctively brushing the red mark on her cheek where Clara's slap had landed. She didn't say a word, but her sharp, icy gaze pierced through Clara like a blade. Around them, passengers sat frozen, their shock rendering them speechless. Clara remained where she stood, her breathing uneven, as though she had realized she'd crossed a line. But instead of apologizing, she straightened her posture and tried to justify herself. "This is my job, and I won't let anyone ruin it," she said, her voice trembling but attempting to sound resolute. Some passengers began murmuring in disapproval, but most remained silent, likely wary of escalating the situation and jeopardizing the rest of the flight. Members of the flight crew approached cautiously in the cabin. The cabinosphere grew even heavier. Simone said nothing more. She simply sat back down, adjusted her posture, and gazed out of the window at the clouds drifting by. Yet, within her, a storm had begun to brew, and she knew this incident was far from over. The air in the cabin had grown so tense it was almost suffocating. Passengers nearby turned to look at Simone, their eyes filled with curiosity and subtle judgment. A few whispered among themselves, but most chose to remain silent, seemingly wary of being drawn into the uncomfortable situation unfolding before them. Clara stood rooted to the spot, her face flushed red from her earlier outburst. She took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure, but her eyes remained defiant as they fixed on Simone. "I won't let this slide so easily," Clara muttered, her voice shaky yet laced with forced resolve. Simone sat up straight, her gaze never wavering from Clara's. "I won't stop you from doing your job," she said, her tone calm yet cutting, "but I suggest you carefully consider the consequences of your actions." Clara bit her lip, retreating a step as if struck by Simone's words. At that moment, another member of the cabin crew hurried over, the young attendant who had earlier assisted Simone. Her expression was a mix of concern and disbelief as she turned to Clara. "Clara, what's going on here?" she asked, her voice low but tense. "We have a disruptive passenger," Clara replied quickly, without hesitation. I suspect she's involved in the theft of another passenger's belongings in this area. Simone said nothing, continuing to watch the scene unfold. She noticed the hesitation in the younger attendant's eyes. It was clear the woman wasn't fully convinced by Clara's claims, but she also seemed reluctant to openly challenge her colleague in front of the passengers. Maybe we should handle this in a more professional manner, the young attendant suggested, her voice measured. I'll call the captain to assess the situation. That won't be necessary. Clara snapped, her tone firm. I can handle this myself. Simone remained seated, her hands resting lightly on her lap, though her sharp gaze betrayed her thoughts. She could see that Clara was escalating the situation, not to resolve it, but to defend her own bruised pride after the slap. This wasn't just an insult to Simone, it was a glaring example of the injustice she had been observing since boarding the flight. A few minutes later, the captain appeared. He was a middle-aged man with a lean build and graying hair that added to his air of experience and authority. His eyes scanned the cabin swiftly before landing on Simone and Clara. "What's going on here?" he asked, his deep voice steady and commanding. Simone watched him closely, waiting for the captain to take control of the tense situation. She knew this moment could shift the dynamic, depending on how he chose to act. Clara quickly explained, her voice attempting to remain calm, though a clear undertone of indignation seeped through. A passenger recently reported a missing watch. I suspect this passenger, she said, pointing directly at Simone, might be involved. When I asked to check her belongings, she resisted and refused to cooperate. Simone sat upright, her gaze locking firmly with the captain's. I did not resist. I merely requested to be treated fairly and not to be accused without evidence, she said, her tone steady and clear. The captain frowned slightly and turned to Clara. Do you have any evidence to support your claim? Clara faltered for a moment. No, but the watch was reported missing in this area and she looks suspicious. Suspicious? The captain repeated, his frown deepening. And what exactly are you basing that conclusion on? Clara fell silent, her eyes shifting nervously before settling back on Simone. I'm just trying to do my job, she muttered, her voice losing its earlier conviction. The captain sighed, turning back to Simone. Ma'am, I sincerely apologize for this inconvenience. If you don't mind, we'd like to quickly inspect your belongings to clear up this matter. Simone remained quiet for a moment before nodding. I'm willing to cooperate, but only under one condition, that every passenger in this section is also subjected to the same inspection. Otherwise, I will consider this an act of discrimination. Her words hung in the air, silencing the cabin. Several passengers looked up at her, their expressions a mix of surprise and admiration. The captain paused, clearly unprepared for such a bold request. After a few seconds, he nodded. Fairness is of utmost importance. I'll instruct the crew to conduct a full inspection of this area. Simone gave a measured nod, her eyes cold but composed. She understood that this was more than a simple luggage check. It was her way of asserting that every individual, regardless of their skin color or background, deserved equal treatment. Deep down, though, she also knew this incident was far from over. It was merely the beginning. After the captain announced that all passengers in the section would have their luggage inspected, the tension in the cabin escalated to an unbearable level. Eyes filled with worry, confusion, and indignation shifted between Simone and each other. Some passengers began whispering, their hushed voices growing louder, reverberating through the already stifling atmosphere. This is unnecessary. Why should I have to open my bag? Protested a middle-aged white man seated by the window. My watch is right here. Why are we all being inconvenienced because of one person? Simone didn't respond, merely observing the reactions around her. She understood that this situation had grown beyond her individual experience. It had become a reflection of the systemic mistreatment people like her often endured in society. Clara still stood nearby, her face pale but her eyes filled with defiance. She hadn't anticipated her impulsive actions leading to such a troublesome predicament. It seemed as though Clara was hoping Simone would lose her composure, say or do something incriminating, and turn herself into the guilty party. But Simone remained seated, her posture upright, and her demeanor composed in a way that was almost unnervingly calm. A younger flight attendant approached, holding a clipboard and attempting to placate the restless passengers. Everyone, please remain calm. These checks are being conducted to ensure security and resolve the issue. We sincerely appreciate your cooperation. Simone glanced at the young attendant and caught a flicker of unease in her expression. It was evident that not everyone on the crew supported Clara's actions, but no one dared to openly challenge her. This complicity through silence was all too familiar to Simone. She had witnessed it countless times throughout her life. The captain signaled for the luggage checks to begin. Some passengers quickly unzipped their bags, eager to comply and minimize the disruption. However, when it came time for Simone's turn, Clara stepped forward, her voice loud enough to carry through the entire cabin. "Now, open your bag, ma'am," Clara demanded, her tone dripping with authority. Simone didn't rise to the provocation. Instead, she calmly unzipped her bag, carefully laying out its contents onto the inspection tray. Her bag contained only a few personal items: a tablet, a leather-bound notebook, a small water bottle, and other essentials. Everything was displayed plainly, with no trace of the missing watch. "Are you satisfied now?" Simone asked, her voice soft yet steely, her eyes locking onto Clara's. Clara didn't answer immediately. She tried to maintain a composed demeanor, but her expression betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. "I'm just doing my job," she muttered quietly, her earlier commanding tone now absent. The captain inspected Simone's bag thoroughly before turning to Clara. "There's nothing here. We made a mistake." Simone remained silent, but her eyes conveyed a subtle hint of irony as she glanced at Clara. "Mistakes can happen," she said, her voice light as a breeze, "but irresponsible behavior is an entirely different matter." The tension in the cabin seemed to ease slightly as the passengers realized Simone had no connection to the missing watch. Some began casting disapproving looks at Clara, while others exhaled in quiet relief. It seemed the matter might finally be resolved, but Clara wasn't ready to let it go. She suddenly raised her voice, saying, "The watch didn't just disappear. She could have hidden it somewhere else. Am I wrong to be suspicious?" Clara's words froze the cabin once again. Simone rose from her seat, and for the first time since she boarded the plane, she allowed her natural authority to shine. "You just admitted you have no evidence, yet you continue to accuse me. This is not how problems are solved. This is bias." Her statement hung in the air like a heavy weight, silencing the entire cabin. Clara's face turned pale, and she said nothing more. The captain swiftly intervened, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Clara, I'll handle this from here. Please return to the crew area and take a break." "But Captain?" Clara began, but he cut her off with a stern look. "That's an order." Clara hesitated, but ultimately turned and walked away, her retreat shadowed by the judgmental gazes of the passengers. Simone, however, found no satisfaction in the moment. She knew Clara's behavior was merely a symptom of a far deeper issue. This wasn't the first time Simone had faced such a situation, but she decided it would be the last time she allowed it to go unchallenged. As Simone sat back down and an unexpected voice broke the silence, a passenger stood up, his voice firm. "I'm sorry, but I can't stay silent any longer. This is blatant discrimination." His words caused a stir in the cabin. Other passengers quickly chimed in. "Exactly. She did nothing wrong," a woman exclaimed. "The way she was treated is disgraceful." Clara disappeared into the crew area under a storm of murmurs and disapproval, but Simone's mind was already elsewhere. Calmly, she reached into her bag and retrieved her phone. She dialed a number and spoke quietly for a few moments with the person on the other end. After finishing the call, she placed her phone back in her bag and leaned against her seat, her gaze fixed ahead. The truth about Simone and the repercussions of everything that had transpired would soon come to light. But for Simone, this was about more than just seeking justice for herself. It was a declaration that injustice and prejudice had no place in the world she was determined to change. Simone sat quietly in her seat, her gaze fixed on the window where white clouds drifted lazily against the blue sky. Yet inside, a smoldering sense of frustration and anger burned. Clara's slap wasn't just a personal insult. It was a glaring testament to the systemic injustice and prejudice Simone had vowed to dismantle the moment she accepted the role of CEO at Orion Air. Her feelings weren't rooted in personal hurt, but in the knowledge that thousands of others could face similar indignities without anyone to stand up for them. Not long after her brief phone call, the atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. A few flight attendants exchanged quiet words, their eyes occasionally darting towards Simone. It seemed the information she had just relayed had sent ripples of unease through the crew. 10 minutes later, the captain himself appeared in Simone's section. He bent slightly toward her, his voice lowered but filled with care. "Miss Carter, I've just received a message from headquarters. May I request that you join me in a private area to discuss this further?" Simone nodded slightly, offering no response beyond that. She stood, adjusted her crisp white blouse, and followed the captain toward the front cabin. All eyes in the economy section tracked her movements, some passengers whispering quietly, while others simply stared with curious expressions. Once the door to the private cabin closed, the captain turned to face Simone, his expression a mixture of unease and regret. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice quiet but filled with respect. "I didn't realize you were the new CEO of Orion Air. I sincerely apologize for everything that has happened." Simone remained composed as she took the seat opposite him. "I don't need your apology," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "I need action." The captain nodded, a bead of sweat forming on his brow. "I understand completely. What happened today is absolutely unacceptable. I will immediately report this incident to headquarters and ensure appropriate action is taken against the employee responsible." Simone tilted her head slightly, her sharp gaze pinning the captain in place. "This isn't just about disciplining an individual. I need to know if you truly recognize the cultural issues entrenched within this system. This isn't the first time a passenger has been subjected to discrimination, and I assure you, if there isn't a fundamental change, it won't be the last." The captain fell silent, clearly unsure how to respond. Simone didn't wait. She stood, her eyes sweeping over him with a cold intensity. "I'll be watching to see how you and your team respond. Remember, I didn't come here for an apology. I came here to get things done." With that, she turned and left the room, her footsteps measured and deliberate as she returned to her seat. This wasn't just a moment of confrontation for Simone. It was a turning point, a declaration that change wasn't just needed, it was imminent. Simone returned to her seat, but this time the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted entirely. Clara, the flight attendant who had slapped Simone earlier, now stood at the back of the cabin, her head bowed, her eyes wide with panic, as she watched the captain signaling for her to step forward. "Clara, I need you in my office immediately," the captain said, his tone devoid of any patience. Clara stammered, her lips trembling. "Captain, I was only doing my job." "That's enough." The captain interrupted, his sharp gaze cutting through her excuses. "I've received direct orders from headquarters. Your actions today not only violate our code of conduct, but have also caused significant damage to Orion Air's reputation. This behavior is intolerable." Clara said nothing more. She lowered her head and walked silently toward the crew area, her departure marked by the disapproving stares of passengers. There was no longer curiosity or support in their eyes, only disappointment and contempt. Simone sat back down, and for the first time during the flight, she felt a small sense of relief. Yet, she knew this was not the end. It was merely the first step in a much longer journey to reform how Orion Air operated. She gazed out of the window, watching the clouds drift lazily against the sky, a gentle reminder that meaningful change always takes time, but it is always worth pursuing. The flight landed in silence. As the passengers began to disembark, Simone exited the cabin with her usual calm and confident demeanor. At the gate, a senior executive from Orion Air was waiting to greet her. "We deeply regret this unfortunate incident, Miss Carter," he said, his voice laced with respect. Simone looked him straight in the eye, her gaze resolute. "Make sure this never happens to anyone again," she replied before walking past him, leaving an air of quiet reverence in her wake. As Simone stepped through the airport doors and into the crisp air outside, she took a deep breath. She knew that monumental changes lay ahead, and she was prepared to face them all. This wasn't just her story. It was the story of everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. Simone Carter was ready to rewrite the future of Orion Air. 3 days after the incident on Flight 705, Simone Carter stepped into the large conference room at Orion Air's headquarters. The room, with its sleek glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city, exuded modernity, but the atmosphere inside was heavy with tension. Seated around the table were all of Orion Air's senior executives, from department heads to legal advisors. The unease was palpable, etched clearly on every face. Simone entered with an air of confidence tempered by gravity. She didn't need to say much. The events on Flight 705 had already rippled through the company. A passenger's video capturing Clara White's blatant mistreatment and slap had circulated widely across internal company forums and even leaked externally. Orion Air was now facing a deluge of criticism from employees and customers alike, leaving them with no choice but to confront the fallout. Simone walked to the head of the table and placed a thick folder on the polished wooden surface. Her gaze swept across the room, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "We have a problem," Simone began, her voice calm but firm. "And it's not just about Clara White or Flight 705. This is a systemic issue, one that stems from how we operate, how we treat our customers, and how we treat each other." The room was utterly silent. No one dared to interrupt. "The video isn't just an isolated incident," Simone continued. "It's a glaring example of the toxic workplace culture we've tolerated for far too long, a culture lacking empathy, fairness, and most importantly, respect for those who are different, and that has to change." Simone opened the folder, pulling out a series of vividly colored reports. She slid them across the table toward the other executives. "These are the customer feedback statistics from the past 3 years. Of the complaints regarding staff behavior, over 60% come from passengers of color or those from other minority groups. Do you think that's a coincidence?" The weight of her words hung in the air, and no one in the room met her gaze. A few murmurs rippled through the room, but no one dared to offer a rebuttal. Simone paused, allowing them time to absorb the gravity of her words. Then she continued, "If we don't take action now, the consequences will be even more severe. Customers will leave us. Good employees won't want to work in an environment like this, and most importantly, we will lose the public's trust, a loss no airline can afford to recover from." She stopped for a moment, her gaze sweeping across the room, meeting each pair of eyes. "I've prepared a comprehensive reform plan. It won't be easy, but if you want Orion Air to survive and thrive, we have no other choice." Simone laid out the details of her plan, which included 3 key initiatives. 1. Unconscious bias training. All employees, from flight attendants to senior leadership, will participate in training programs focused on recognizing unconscious biases and handling situations with fairness. 2. Independent grievance oversight. A dedicated team will be established to handle complaints from both customers and employees, ensuring transparency and impartiality. 3. Cultural reform. Create a workplace environment where everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background, feels respected and valued. "We won't just address individual violators," Simone concluded. "We're going to change the entire system so that no one can behave like Clara White ever again." A department director, known for his conservative views, spoke up. "Miss Carter, I can't deny that you're right, but changing corporate culture isn't something that happens overnight. Do we have the time and resources to make this happen?" Simone smiled faintly, but her eyes remained resolute. "We don't have a choice. If we don't change, we won't have a future." 2 weeks later, the reform program was officially launched. Clara White, the flight attendant who had slapped Simone, was immediately terminated. Orion Air issued a public apology to Simone and its entire customer base, pledging to do better in the future. For Simone, however, this was only the beginning of the journey. At a major internal conference, she stepped onto the stage, facing hundreds of Orion Air employees. Her voice carried both conviction and emotion as she began, "Change is never easy, but it is necessary. Every step we take today will build a better Orion Air tomorrow, a place where everyone, no matter who they are, feels welcomed and respected." The auditorium erupted into applause as employees rose to their feet in unison. Simone gazed out at the audience, her heart steady with resolve. She knew that her efforts weren't just for herself, but for the thousands, even millions of people out there who deserved a fairer, more humane experience. Simone understood that the road ahead would be long and challenging, but she was ready to face whatever lay ahead. This moment marked the start of a new era for Orion Air, one built on equity, respect, and unwavering determination. Simone Carter is not just a CEO. She is a symbol of resilience, courage, and the determination to make a difference. The incident on Flight 705 wasn't a setback. It was an opportunity for her to prove that injustice and prejudice have no place in the modern world. Since embarking on her journey to reform Orion Air, Simone has laid the foundation for a fairer environment, one where every employee and customer feels valued and respected. This story is not just a lesson in professionalism, but a powerful reminder that sometimes all it takes is one person to stand up and ignite change across an entire system. Thank you for following this inspiring story. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more meaningful stories like this. Let's spread the message together. Respecting differences is the key to building a better future.